It was a quiet Saturday morning, and the sun had just started rising above the rooftops. The street was calm, with only the soft sound of birds in the trees and the faint hum of a lawnmower a few houses away. Inside his home, he was finally enjoying a moment of peace. After serving years in the Navy, life had slowed down for him. He enjoyed simple routines now: coffee on the porch, watching his children play in the yard, and working on small projects around the house. He valued quiet mornings more than anything else because they reminded him that he had earned his peace through years of hard work and discipline. That morning, he was seated in the living room with a book in his hand, while his wife was in the kitchen preparing breakfast. Their children were still upstairs, enjoying a bit of weekend rest. Suddenly, the silence was broken by a loud, aggressive pounding on the front door. It wasn't the polite kind of knock a neighbor would use, it was the kind that made the walls shake. His heart jumped, and his wife froze in the kitchen, looking toward the door with wide eyes. Before he could even stand, voices erupted from outside. "You're in violation. Open this door now." The shouts were sharp and commanding, as though a raid was happening. His training taught him to stay calm, but his instincts told him something was wrong. He wasn't expecting anyone, and certainly not this kind of behavior. The pounding grew louder. Then, with one final slam, the door cracked open. The wooden frame split, and the lock gave way as a group of men pushed their way inside. They weren't police officers. Their uniforms were mismatched security vests, radios clipped to their belts, and caps with HOA printed across them. These were the so-called HOA cops, a private security group hired by the neighborhood's homeowners association. His wife gasped and stepped back, clutching the counter. The children, now awake from the noise, ran halfway down the stairs and froze when they saw strangers pushing into their home. He quickly signaled to them with his hand to stay put, his voice steady, "It's okay. Don't come down." The men spread out in the entryway as though they had authority over the house. Their leader, a tall man with sunglasses still on indoors, shouted again, "You're in violation of HOA rules. We told you this was your last warning." Confused, he took a step forward. "Violation? What are you talking about? You can't just break into my home." His voice was calm but firm, the kind of tone that came from years of training, not fear. The leader waved a stack of papers. "Your yard is overgrown, your flag isn't regulation size, and your fence hasn't been painted the approved color. You've ignored notices, so now we're here to take action." His jaw tightened. These were petty complaints, the kind most people resolved with simple letters or small fines. But this group was treating it like a criminal offense. His wife whispered from behind him, "This isn't right, they can't do this." The children, scared and uncertain, huddled together on the stairs. He knew he had to protect them not with aggression, but with control. He took a deep breath and looked the men straight in the eyes. "This is my home. You've crossed a line by breaking into it. If you had concerns, you should have handled it the proper way, not like this." But the men didn't back down. They continued to bark out accusations, listing off minor issues as if they were crimes. One of them even started walking toward the kitchen, glancing around as though inspecting the house. His wife raised her voice, trembling but brave, "You don't have the right to be in here. Get out." Still, they didn't move. The leader smirked, clearly enjoying the power he thought he had. He leaned closer and repeated, "We're in charge here. You're in violation, and we decide what happens next." For a moment, the air was thick with tension. His heart was steady, his breathing controlled. This wasn't the battlefield, but the discipline he had learned in the Navy guided him now. He knew anger would only escalate the situation. Instead, he studied each of them the way they stood, the way they tried to project authority without truly having it. He recognized what this was: intimidation. He raised his voice just enough for everyone in the room to hear. "You will leave my house. Right now. I will not ask again. His calmness carried more weight than shouting ever could. The men hesitated. They hadn't expected him to stand tall without showing fear. For a second, uncertainty flashed across their faces. But the leader, unwilling to lose face in front of his group, scoffed and tossed the stack of papers onto the floor. Fine. But this isn't over. You'll regret ignoring us. With that, he signaled his men, and they slowly backed out of the house, muttering under their breath. As soon as the door closed behind them, his wife rushed to his side, shaken. The children finally came down, clinging to their parents, asking if everything was okay. He hugged them tightly, reassuring them in a soft voice, "It's over for now. You're safe." But deep inside, he knew it wasn't over. The HOA cops had shown their true colors, and he couldn't ignore it. Breaking into someone's home over small neighborhood complaints was not just wrong, it was dangerous. He looked at the broken door, the splintered wood on the floor, and felt a mix of anger and responsibility. This wasn't just about him anymore. If they could do this to his family, they could do it to anyone in the neighborhood. He spent the rest of the day calming his family, checking on the house, and making sure everyone felt secure. But his mind was already working quietly. He thought about the people in his community, about the neighbors who often whispered about the HOA's heavy-handed tactics but never dared to speak out. Fear had kept them silent, but fear could not rule forever. As night fell, he stood on the porch, the cool air brushing against his face. The stars above reminded him of long nights at sea, when he and his team watched the sky while guarding each other's lives. Those memories brought him clarity. He wasn't alone, not in the past, and not now. He still had his brothers, men who stood for honor, discipline, and justice. He whispered to himself, almost like a vow, "They crossed the wrong line this time." And with that, a plan began forming in his mind, calm, precise, and unshakable. The next morning came with heavy silence in the house. The broken door had been repaired with a temporary wooden board, but the marks of the forced entry were still clear. His wife kept glancing at it, as if expecting another sudden knock. The children moved around the house quietly, their laughter replaced with cautious whispers. What had always been a safe and warm home now felt unsettled, almost like an open wound that hadn't healed. He sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, staring at the sunlight falling across the floor. His mind replayed the events of yesterday. Every detail, the pounding at the door, the shouting, the arrogance of those men, played like a film he couldn't turn off. He had faced worse in combat zones, but this felt different. This had happened inside his home, in front of his family, where they should have been safest. His wife broke the silence. "What if they come back?" Her voice trembled with worry. "What if they try something again?" He reached across the table and took her hand. "They won't," he said firmly. "Not like that. They wanted to scare us, but they only showed how weak they really are." Still, she looked unconvinced. He couldn't blame her. Yesterday's scene was not something easily forgotten. Children should never have to see strangers barging into their home, yelling about things that didn't matter. He knew that fear could linger in their young minds, shaping how they saw the world. That thought made his decision even clearer. This had to stop, not just for his family, but for everyone in the neighborhood. Later that day, he stepped outside to clear his head. The neighborhood seemed quiet, but there was a hidden tension in the air. Some neighbors peeked out from behind curtains when he walked past, then quickly pulled them shut. A few nodded politely but avoided eye contact. He could tell they had heard about what happened. Word always spread fast in tight communities. As he walked down the street, an elderly neighbor finally approached him. "I heard what those HOA men did," the man whispered nervously. "They did something similar to my nephew a few months ago. Threats, fines, even banged on his door late at night. He didn't want trouble, so he just paid them off." He frowned. "Why didn't anyone report it?" The old man shook his head quickly. People are scared. They control the board, the fines, even the security around here. If you fight them, they make your life harder. They'll ticket your car, harass your kids at the playground, send endless notices until you can't keep up. The Navy veteran listened carefully. It confirmed what he already suspected: this wasn't just about him. The HOA had created an environment of fear, using authority like a weapon. His jaw tightened as he thought about how many families were silently suffering. That evening, he sat with his wife on the porch while the children played quietly inside. The sunset painted the sky orange and gold, but neither of them were relaxed enough to enjoy it. His wife spoke again. You can't take them on alone. They'll come back stronger if you do. He nodded slowly. She was right. He wasn't planning to face them alone. For years, he had lived by a rule: never fight without a team. In the Navy, teamwork wasn't just important, it was survival. He still had that team. Brothers who would answer his call at any hour. They weren't just old war buddies, they were family forged by loyalty and shared battles. After the children went to bed, he picked up his phone. He scrolled through his contacts until he found the familiar names. He hesitated for a moment, not because he doubted them, but because he knew what his call meant. These were men who had built their lives after service, just like him. They had jobs, families, responsibilities. But something inside told him they wouldn't see this as just his fight, it was a fight for respect, for what was right. He pressed the first number. The phone barely rang before a familiar voice answered. Brother, it's been too long. What's going on? He explained everything, from the pounding on the door to the forced entry and the threats. There was a pause on the other end, then a sharp reply: that's not happening on my watch. Tell me where and when. One by one, he called the others. Each responded the same way, without hesitation, without excuses. They didn't ask, why should I? They simply said, I'm there. That was the bond they had. Time, distance, and civilian life couldn't break it. By midnight, he had confirmation that his old teammates would arrive over the weekend. They weren't coming to fight. They weren't coming to cause chaos. They were coming because one of their own had been disrespected, and in their world, that meant everyone had been disrespected. He put his phone down and leaned back, exhaling slowly. His wife, who had been listening quietly, placed her hand on his shoulder. Are you sure about this? She asked softly. Yes, he replied, his voice steady. This isn't about fighting. It's about showing them what real discipline looks like. They think power comes from yelling and breaking doors. We'll show them it comes from respect, order, and standing together. The following day, he began preparing. Not in the way most would expect: no weapons, no aggressive tactics. Instead, he started gathering information. He looked through every notice the HOA had ever sent. He studied the board members, their roles, and the private security group they called HOA Cops. He researched the rules, the violations, and the fines that had been given to neighbors over the past few years. Patterns began to emerge: rules were enforced unfairly, punishments were harsher on certain families, and some board members benefited financially from the chaos they created. At one point, he looked at the stack of papers on the table and shook his head. They're not protecting the community. They're exploiting it. That night, he shared everything with his wife. This isn't just about our door or our yard. This is bigger. They've been using fear to control people. That ends now. She looked into his eyes, seeing the determination she had known years ago when he wore his uniform. Slowly, she nodded. Then I trust you. Just promise me you'll keep it peaceful. I promise, he said. We'll do this the right way. As he prepared for his teammates' arrival, something shifted inside him. Yesterday, he had felt frustration and anger. Today, he felt purpose. The intimidation of the HOA cops had lit a fire in him, not to fight recklessly, but to lead with the same principles that had guided him in service, honor, discipline, and teamwork. The weekend arrived quicker than expected. The house was still under repair, and the temporary board on the front door served as a daily reminder of what had happened. But inside the home, the mood was changing. There was less fear and more quiet determination. His children were slowly starting to smile again, especially after hearing that Daddy's friends were coming over. They didn't know the full story, but they felt comfort in the thought of more trusted adults filling the house with laughter and warmth. On Saturday morning, the first of his old teammates pulled into the driveway. The sound of a truck engine hummed outside, and when he stepped out to greet the driver, the years seemed to melt away. A tall man with broad shoulders and a sharp grin stepped out of the truck, carrying only a duffel bag. "Brother," the man said, pulling him into a firm embrace. "You call, I come. That simple." He smiled, a wave of relief washing over him. "Good to see you, Mark." Mark had served with him overseas, side by side on missions that tested every limit of their endurance. Seeing him here brought back memories of long nights, heavy gear, and the unspoken trust that kept them alive. Within hours, more vehicles arrived. One by one, the rest of the team showed up, each greeted with hugs, laughter, and stories that started pouring out as if no time had passed. They were older now, with families and careers, but the bond was unchanged. His wife watched from the doorway, her heart softening as she saw the way her husband's eyes lit up around them. She knew this reunion wasn't just about friendship, it was about strength, healing, and unity. By evening, the living room was filled with voices and the smell of food. Plates of dinner sat on the table, and laughter echoed through the house for the first time in weeks. The children loved the company, sitting close to the men who told funny stories about their father's younger days. The atmosphere was warm, but beneath the surface, everyone knew why they had gathered. After the children went to bed and the house grew quiet, the men shifted from laughter to focus. They gathered around the table, where he had already spread out documents, notices, and photos. His voice grew firm as he explained everything that had happened. "They broke down my door. They shouted in front of my family. All because of things as small as the color of a fence and the size of a flag. But this isn't just about me. Neighbors have been living in fear. They've been bullied, fined, and humiliated. These so-called HOA cops think they're untouchable." The men listened carefully, their expressions serious. They weren't just friends listening to a story, they were professionals analyzing a situation. They asked questions, studied the documents, and exchanged glances that only people with shared experience could understand. Finally, Mark leaned back and crossed his arms. "So what you're saying is, this isn't just a dispute. This is a system built on intimidation." He nodded. "Exactly. And it's time we show them there's a better way to handle responsibility. They've mistaken fear for respect. That needs to change." Another teammate, a quiet but sharp-minded man named Daniel, spoke up. "We're not here to fight. We're here to send a message. That message has to be clear, legal, and strong. If they can do this to you, they can do this to anyone. But if we show them what real order looks like, they'll think twice before abusing power again." The room fell into thoughtful silence for a moment. Then, as naturally as they had done years ago, the team began planning. They studied the HOA's so-called headquarters, a rented office in the local community center. It wasn't heavily guarded, but it was where the board members met and where the HOA cops often reported. The men took notes on the location, the layout, and the times the board gathered. There was no talk of breaking in or causing chaos. Instead, the plan was simple: walk in as a unit, calm and professional, and demand accountability. But it wasn't just about walking in. They wanted to prepare every detail. They printed copies of laws about trespassing and illegal entry, highlighted the rules of homeowner rights, and gathered testimonies from neighbors who had quietly shared their own stories of harassment. It wasn't a mission of force, it was a mission of truth. At one point, his wife entered the room with tea and listened quietly as they spoke. When she heard their plan, her worry began to ease. This wasn't reckless. It wasn't about revenge. It was about standing tall in a way that couldn't be denied. She placed the tray down and whispered, "Just promise me one thing. Promise me no one will come back here frightened again." He looked at her with steady eyes. "I promise. That's why we're doing this." The next day, the team continued their quiet preparation. They walked around the neighborhood in pairs, not drawing attention but carefully observing. They spoke to neighbors, offering reassurance and listening to stories. Many residents admitted that they, too, had faced unfair treatment. Some had been fined for harmless decorations, others had been threatened with eviction for minor repairs not finished on time. One young mother confessed, "I wanted to complain, but I was afraid. Last time I said something, they doubled my fines. I can't afford that." The men listened patiently, their calm presence already making the woman feel stronger. They assured her that things were about to change. Word slowly began to spread, someone was finally standing up to the HOA. That evening, the team regrouped at the house. They sat outside under the stars, just as they used to on long deployments. The cool night air carried a sense of calm, but also purpose. One of the men broke the silence. "Feels like old times, doesn't it?" He smiled faintly. "Yes. Except this time, the mission is different. We're not overseas. We're here to protect a community, to show people they don't have to live in fear." Mark chuckled. "Doesn't matter where we are. A mission's a mission. And when we stand together, we don't lose." The words settled over the group like a quiet oath. Each man nodded, not needing to say more. They all understood. Tomorrow, they would walk into that HOA office not as aggressors, but as a wall of discipline and respect that no amount of shouting could break. Before heading inside, he stood for a moment, looking at his house. The light from the porch glowed softly, and inside, his wife tucked the children into bed. For the first time in days, he felt peace, not because the problem was solved yet, but because he wasn't facing it alone. He whispered softly, almost to himself, "We're ready." And in that moment, the plan stopped being just an idea. It became a promise. A promise that the intimidation would end, that respect would return, and that a community would learn the difference between false power and true strength. The sun was already high in the sky when the men gathered at the house. Breakfast plates were still on the table, but no one was really focused on food. Today was the day. The atmosphere carried a mixture of calm and quiet intensity, the kind of feeling that comes before a mission. Even though years had passed since they last worked together, the habits of discipline came back easily. They moved with quiet coordination, speaking in short, clear sentences. His wife stood near the door, watching them prepare. She had seen this look before, many years ago, when he left for deployments. It wasn't anger or aggression, it was focus. The children, still too young to understand everything, clung to her side. She bent down and reassured them softly, "Daddy and his friends are just going to talk to some people. Nothing to worry about." By mid-morning, the team stepped outside. Dressed in simple clothes, nothing flashy, they didn't look like a squad ready for confrontation. Yet their presence together was enough to turn heads. Neighbors watering their lawns or walking their dogs paused, sensing something unusual. For the first time, instead of looking away, many gave small nods of encouragement. Word had spread, and people silently hoped this would be the day things changed. They drove in 2 vehicles to the community center where the HOA office was located. The streets were quiet, but inside the vehicles, there was a steady rhythm of calm breathing and occasional short comments, like checkpoints before an operation. Everyone ready? Mark asked. A few nods followed. Always, Daniel replied. When they arrived, the parking lot was half full. Cars belonging to the board members and the security group lined the spaces. From the outside, the building looked ordinary: glass doors, a modest sign, and a row of potted plants near the entrance. But to many in the neighborhood, it represented intimidation and stress. The men stepped out of the vehicles and walked together. They didn't rush, they didn't drag their feet. Their pace was even, steady, and firm. People nearby glanced up, curious, but no one dared approach. Inside the office, the board members were already gathered. A long wooden table sat in the center of the room, with papers and laptops spread across it. Some members leaned back in their chairs, sipping coffee, while others spoke casually about fines and notices. A couple of the so-called HOA cops stood near the door, arms folded, smirking as though they owned the space. The laughter inside grew louder until the door opened. Silence immediately fell. He stepped in first, his team following close behind. No one spoke right away, but the energy in the room shifted instantly. The board members straightened in their chairs, and the security guards exchanged uneasy glances. These were not just ordinary residents walking in. The way the men carried themselves, their posture, their calm expressions, their steady steps commanded attention without a single word. He walked to the center of the room and stopped. His team stood behind him, forming a quiet but undeniable wall of presence. For a few seconds, no one moved. The board members looked at each other, waiting for someone else to speak first. Finally, the leader of the board cleared his throat and tried to sound confident. "Can we help you with something?" His voice was calm but firm as he replied, "Yes. You can start by explaining why your men broke into my home in front of my family." The room went still. A few board members shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. The two security men at the door stiffened, but they didn't move forward. One of the board members tried to brush it off. "Now, let's not exaggerate. Our security team was simply enforcing community rules. If you had complied with notices." He raised his hand slightly, cutting him off without raising his voice. "Enforcing rules does not mean breaking into homes. Enforcing rules does not mean shouting at children. What you did was illegal, and you know it." The board leader frowned, trying to regain control. "Look, this is private property, and we have the authority to ensure everything meets the standards of this community." Daniel stepped forward, placing a folder on the table. "Authority doesn't give you the right to break the law. These are copies of the statutes you violated: trespassing, unlawful entry, harassment. You crossed boundaries you had no right to cross." The board leader opened his mouth, but before he could argue, Mark leaned closer, his voice steady and low. "You've been hiding behind fear for too long. People pay dues to live in peace, not to be threatened in their own homes. That ends today." The room grew tense. The smirks had vanished from the faces of the security guards. They shifted uncomfortably, as if realizing they were outmatched not in strength, but in discipline. One of the younger board members finally spoke, his voice nervous. "Look, maybe things went too far. But you have to understand, we were just trying to keep the community in order." He shook his head slowly. "Order doesn't come from fear. It comes from respect. You've mistaken one for the other. And now the entire neighborhood is paying the price." He placed his own stack of papers on the table, copies of notices, testimonies from neighbors, and evidence of unfair practices. One by one, he laid them out like cards, each piece of paper heavier than the last. "We've spoken to families. We've listened to their stories. You've fined people unfairly, threatened them, and pushed them into silence. That silence is over." The weight of his words filled the room. The board members glanced at each other, their confidence slipping away. Daniel spoke again, his tone sharp but calm. You have two choices. You can continue down this path and face legal action not just from one family, but from the entire neighborhood. Or you can step back, correct your mistakes, and start running this community with fairness. The silence stretched for a long moment. Finally, the board leader leaned back in his chair, the arrogance fading from his eyes. He looked at the men standing before him, and for the first time, he saw not just individuals, but a united front that he couldn't intimidate. He exhaled slowly. What do you want? He met his eyes without flinching. Simple. Apologize for what happened. Repair what you damaged. Stop sending your so-called cops into people's homes. And run this community with respect instead of fear. The board members whispered among themselves, their earlier confidence replaced with unease. They knew they had been exposed. They knew the neighborhood could rally behind this if pushed further. The presence of the men in the room was a reminder that intimidation wouldn't work anymore. Finally, one of the older board members nodded. We can agree to that. The leader hesitated but eventually gave a stiff nod as well. Fine. We'll issue a formal apology and review our enforcement policies. Mark's expression softened slightly, but his words carried weight. Make sure you do. Because this isn't just about one family. It's about every family that calls this place home. The team stood silently as the board scribbled notes and avoided eye contact. When everything was said, they turned and left the room. They hadn't raised their voices, they hadn't made threats, but their presence had spoken louder than anything else. Outside, the fresh air felt different. Lighter. Free. The men walked together toward the vehicles, the weight of the moment still settling in. Neighbors nearby, who had been too nervous to gather inside, now stood quietly on the sidewalks, watching. They didn't know the full details, but they could sense something had shifted. He looked around at the familiar faces of his neighbors' faces that no longer looked only fearful, but curious, and maybe even hopeful. He gave a small nod, as if silently promising them that better days were ahead. When they arrived back at his house, his wife was waiting on the porch. The children peeked out from behind her, eyes wide with curiosity. She searched his face, and when she saw the calm confidence in his eyes, she knew the days following the meeting at the HOA office were unlike any the neighborhood had seen before. Word spread quickly. At first, it was whispers, neighbors asking one another if they had heard what happened, wondering if it was true that the board had finally backed down. Then, the whispers turned into open conversations. People who had once avoided speaking up began sharing their own experiences freely. For the first time, they no longer felt alone. At his home, the atmosphere was different too. His wife walked around with less worry on her face, and the children returned to their playful laughter. The broken door was repaired, this time not with a temporary board but with a new, strong frame paid for by the very group that had damaged it. When the workers left, a quiet sense of justice filled the air. The next week, a formal letter was delivered to every household in the community. It was from the HOA board, written with carefully chosen words. The letter acknowledged that mistakes had been made. It promised changes: no more aggressive tactics, no more unannounced inspections, and no more so-called HOA cops barging into people's homes. Instead, the board said it would focus on cooperation and fair enforcement of rules. At the bottom of the letter was something no one had expected: an apology. Neighbors who read the letter felt a wave of relief. Some laughed in disbelief, others shook their heads in amazement. But everyone knew the same thing: this letter would never have been written if someone hadn't stood up first. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the street in warm orange light, a few neighbors gathered outside his house. They came with plates of food, kind words, and genuine gratitude. One elderly woman handed his wife a pie and whispered, "Thank you for reminding us we don't have to be afraid." The children played together on the lawn, their laughter echoing across the street. It was the kind of scene he had always wanted for his family: peaceful, safe, and full of community spirit. As he stood on the porch watching, one of his teammates, Mark, walked up beside him. "Looks like you've started something bigger than just fixing a door," Mark said with a grin. He smiled back. "It wasn't just me. It was all of us. People just needed to see that fear doesn't have to control their lives." The rest of the team had started preparing to leave, heading back to their own families and lives. Yet each one left with a sense of pride, knowing they had once again stood together for something that mattered. Before leaving, Daniel shook his hand firmly and said, "You don't need us here anymore. You've given this neighborhood the courage it needed. But if you ever call again, you know we'll come." When the vehicles finally pulled out of the driveway, his wife stood beside him, watching the tail lights disappear. "It feels strange, doesn't it? Having the house full of voices and now back to quiet again." He nodded. "Strange, but good. This time, the quiet feels safe." The following weeks showed real change. The board, once seen as untouchable, now acted with caution. Notices were polite and respectful. Meetings were open and fair. The security team that once called themselves HOA Cops was dissolved completely, replaced with a simple neighborhood watch made up of volunteers. And slowly, trust began to rebuild. For him, life returned to the routine he cherished. He woke early to enjoy coffee on the porch, waving to neighbors who now greeted him openly instead of hiding behind curtains. He helped his children with school projects, repaired small things around the yard, and spent evenings walking with his wife. Yet something was different. He felt the bond of community in every smile, every nod, every small act of kindness. One Saturday morning, as he worked on his fence, a neighbor walked over. It was the young mother he had spoken to weeks earlier, the one who had been too afraid to complain about her fines. She held a tray of cookies, her child running happily in the grass. "I just wanted to thank you," she said shyly, "for giving us back our voice." He wiped his hands on a cloth and accepted the tray with a smile. "You don't owe me thanks. This was about all of us. A community only works when people look out for each other." Her eyes softened. "Still, we're grateful. You reminded us what that really means." As she walked back to her home, he felt a deep sense of satisfaction, not from pride, but from knowing that his actions had sparked something lasting. That night, he sat on the porch again, watching the stars. The cool breeze carried the faint sound of children playing down the street and the chatter of neighbors enjoying the evening. His wife joined him, leaning her head on his shoulder. "Do you ever miss it?" she asked quietly. "The Navy. The missions. The adrenaline." He thought for a moment, then shook his head gently. "Sometimes I miss the team. The brotherhood. But what I don't miss is the fight. I had enough of that. What I have now is better. Peace. Family. And a community that's learning to stand together." She smiled, closing her eyes as she rested against him. "And you still have the team, you know. They may not be here every day, but you know they're always there." He nodded. "Yes. That's something I'll never lose." As the night grew darker, he reflected on everything that had happened. The pounding at the door, the shouting, the fear on his children's faces, it all seemed distant now, like a shadow that had finally lifted. What remained was a stronger community, a safer home, and a reminder that true power doesn't come from fear or force. It comes from unity, respect, and the courage to stand up for what's right. And in the quiet of that evening, he felt grateful. Grateful for his family, for his friends, for the lessons of his past, and for the chance to use them in a way that brought peace instead of conflict. He whispered softly, as if to the stars above, "This is the life I fought for." The porch light glowed warmly, the sounds of laughter drifted through the neighborhood, and for the first time in a long time, everything felt exactly as it should.